lesson of the quarter. March is a change, and quarters, are 3 months, and so break the year up into 4 sections. 3 times 4 is 12. Hopefully you understand quarterly. That's why we call our books quarterly, is because they usually last a quarter. Anyway, just helping you out there a little bit. And so we started a new unit today. We finished up our unit about hearing the voice of God, obeying the voice of God, following that. And I thought that was a really good one. And if you didn't get in on that, you might want to call, or you might want to go to my YouTube channel and find that and maybe watch those. They were pretty good. So today, the title of this unit, it's 6 lessons. So we'll cover this the next 6 weeks, entitled My Encounter with Jesus. And I don't know if your mind's already thinking, but maybe it's thinking in a direction. And if there's 6 weeks and it's about encountering Jesus, where do you think we're going to end up? Well, 6 weeks from today is Easter Sunday. So I'm just helping you out there a little bit. That's where we're going to be. Okay. Today, then, our lesson is from John chapter 4. And that's a really interesting encounter with Jesus. It's what we know to be Jesus' statement or John's statement in John's gospel, where he talks about Jesus must needs go through Samaria, in the King James, or in some other translations, he had a reason, or he had a purpose in going through Samaria. And so, of course, that's the story where Jesus encountered the woman at the well of Sychar, and Jacob's well there. And so that's what we're going to look at today. And it tells us about a woman who had a need. She had tried to meet that need in a variety of ways in her life and never been fulfilled. And then she met Jesus at the well, and he offered her living water. And so let's just talk about it. Let's jump into it. John's gospel, probably John was the youngest of the disciples. He referred to himself in his gospel as the disciple whom Jesus loved, probably because he was the youngest. He was maybe the most tender. Some of those old guys have been fishermen for a while, and they were a little more calloused, a little more coarse. And John and James, his brother, the sons of Zebedee, they were called the sons of thunder, because thunder was Zebedee. He was, pretty boastful guy, evidently, and outgoing. And so they most scholars would say that John's gospel was written sometime between 80 and 100 AD. We know that the book of Revelation, John, the disciple of Jesus, was the author, and John wrote that probably in the late 90s, somewhere 90. I've seen early as 93. Most might say 96 to 98, somewhere in there. And so about 175 AD, early Christian apologist Irenaeus, maybe that's a name you've heard. Irenaeus, his writings indicated that John's gospel was the last of the 4. We have the 3 synoptics, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and then John's gospel would have been the last written. And we know, just because we read them, the synoptics are in a certain parallel. They're in a certain order. They kind of follow the same intent there. Whereas John's gospel is really different. It's a lot more developed. It's more theologically based. It is a little more focused on who Jesus was and who he was trying to reach. And so John didn't begin his gospel with the same story of birth as Matthew and Luke did. He began talking about the beginning. And he said, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And the same was with him in the beginning, he says. And so so he starts to that point, and then he begins to unfold how Jesus actually began to do ministry. And of course, in John chapter 2, we have the Jesus and his mother Mary were at a wedding, and they ran out of wine, and Jesus performed what is referred to as his first public miracle. And then we have in John chapter 3, where Jesus was encountered by a Pharisee who was searching, named Nicodemus. And Jesus, when he talked to Nicodemus, he didn't, tell him you got to have water. I better turn it into wine for you. He didn't do that kind of thing. He simply said you got to be born again. And so Nicodemus, from his perspective, that was what he needed to hear in order to put his faith and trust in Jesus. And then today we come to John chapter 4, where Jesus has to go through Samaria. It's on his agenda. It wasn't something that Jews did. Matter of fact, they would go clear over on the other side of the Jordan to get around going through Samaria, the northern kingdom, or the northern place where the Samaritans were from. He just didn't go through there. You didn't do that. But Jesus did. He and his disciples went through, and at Jacob's well, they encountered a woman. We don't know her name. That might be a cool thing to learn when we get to heaven. Maybe not. But it might be something interesting to know. This woman who had been human in all aspects of humanity, and yet Jesus came and he showed her a better way. He introduced her to God's way of thinking and doing life. So here's the story. Jesus and his disciples have gone that way. They've gone through Samaria. It was a racial thing. It was like, there's some places, some cities where some of us might not be accepted. And so we just don't go that way. We just don't go through there. And anyway, Jesus went there. They stopped outside of the city of Sychar. The disciples went in to buy food because it was lunchtime. It's time to eat. And then Jesus stayed by the well, and a woman came out, and he encountered her. She encountered him. So let's read it, beginning in chapter 4 of John, verse 7. It says, a woman of Samaria came to draw water. Give me a drink, Jesus said to her, because his disciples had gone into town to buy food. How is it that you, a Jew, ask for a drink from me, a Samaritan woman? She asked him, for Jews did not associate with Samaritans. And Jesus answered, if you knew the gift of God and who is saying to you, give me a drink, you would ask him, and he would give you living water. Sir, said the woman, you don't even have a bucket, and the well is so deep, so where do you get this living water? You aren't greater than our father Jacob, are you? He gave us the well and drank from it himself, as did his sons and livestock. And Jesus said, everyone who drinks from this water will get thirsty again. But whoever drinks from the water that I will give him will never get thirsty again. In fact, the water I will give him will become a well of water springing up in him for eternal life. So the first thing we see is that Jesus reveals that we have a greater thirst, doesn't he? He reveals a greater thirst in me. After Jesus had left Judea, he'd encountered Nicodemus, and then here they are on their way back to the Galilee, the northern area, and they go through Samaria. And as they went through Samaria, Jesus had a need to encounter this woman. Why didn't they go through Samaria? Well, it was a racial thing. The Jews and the Samaritans had fought since the Babylonian captivity. The Jews had criticized the Samaritans for intermarrying when they were away when they had been taken off into exile, when the northern kingdom fell. And so the Jews, when they were taken to Babylon, they vowed, we're not going to intermingle, we're not going to intermarry, we're not going to do that kind of thing. We're simply going to keep our line pure, so that when they came back to Jerusalem to rebuild and to settle the land again, the Samaritans wanted to come help. And mostly because they'd been there and they really hadn't done much for themselves. And so they were kind of going to lay claim to Jerusalem, even though the kingdoms had already split after Samson. And so, not Samson, Solomon, I'll get it right, had already split then. And so um, they wanted to help rebuild. And the Jews said, nothing doing, we're going to do it on our own. Well, I don't think they trusted him. And then they proved that they weren't trustworthy because they pulled all kinds of shenanigans to keep them from getting the walls built and getting everything secured and taken care of. So anyway, that uh, it was a racial thing. It was a thing where they were not cooperating together. And so that had just carried through. They despised each other. So that was one thing that was kind of there. And then the other thing was men didn't talk to women. Men didn't talk to women, especially about theological things. Men still don't, unless it's behind closed doors with their wives. Jewish men interact and debate and study together with Jewish men. They don't do that with women. And so this woman comes to the well. It's noonday, lunchtime. It's in the middle of the day, and it's the hottest time of the day. Usually women didn't go to the well, the hottest time of the day. They went when it was cooler because, you can work up pretty good sweat carrying that back to your home. And plus women didn't always go alone. They often went with someone else. They usually went in a group of women. And so they went maybe for protection, maybe just for companionship, camaraderie. And so, but they would go do those tasks together. And so it was surprising that she would come, that she would be there, and then that Jesus would really initiate the conversation, that he would draw near to her. And what did he ask her? He said, "Give me a drink, will you?" And she's like, "Why are you talking to me? What is the deal here? Who are you anyway?" And then he's like, if you knew who was asking for a drink, you'd ask me for a drink, because I got the kind of stuff that you're going to want to drink, and the kind of stuff that Jesus had to drink, nothing like it anywhere. And she said, "Wow, you don't even have a bucket, dude. You don't even have a rope. How the Jacob's well is like over 100 feet deep." And so she's like, you don't even have anything to get water with. What in the world are you thinking you're going to get a drink? No wonder you're asking me, and then you're going to try to give me something that I don't even know how you're going to get. And so, in that, Jesus is really beginning to unpack some things very concisely. Now, how did the disciples know? How did John know? This is how Jesus dealt with her, because they'd already gone into town to get some food. How do they know this? I believe the woman told him afterward. I think she couldn't stop telling everybody what Jesus had said, what he had done. And I believe that they didn't have any problem remembering this story. You and I shouldn't either, because it's a great story. So she said to him, "You don't have anything to drink with." But he said to her, "If you knew who I was, you'd be asking me for a drink." Because he said, "The water I give, the water I'd give to you, it will become a well of water springing up in him like eternal life." So Jesus used physical thirst, one of the most intense, necessary cravings to human beings. He used that to reveal that this woman had a spiritual thirst that she had been trying to satisfy with no avail. She had tried that in her life, and your spiritual thirst is even more intense than a physical thirst, because it's the thing that we cannot find unless we find Jesus. So, some people thirst for things, don't they? There are a lot of people who thirst for money. There are people who thirst for fame. There are people who thirst for pleasure. They thirst for some kind of validation. Can I be the best at what I am? But this deeper thirst, you can't satisfy in the world. Only Jesus gives it. To have a relationship with God, to know the Messiah, to know that Jesus is the Christ, that he is the anointed one. That's what Jesus was trying to get her to see in this conversation, that there was a greater thirst in her she wasn't even yet aware of, and yet he could satisfy it. And if that thirst is satisfied, all thirsts can be satisfied. Okay, so then we get to the second section. We look at verses 15 through 18. And the woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water so that I won't get thirsty and come here to draw water." And Jesus said to her, "Go call your husband and then come back here." And she said, "I don't have a husband." And Jesus said, "You have said correctly, I don't have a husband. For you have had 5 husbands, and the man you are with now is not your husband. What you have said is true." So Jesus revealed her sin to her. Where had she been looking to get her thirst quenched? In relationships with men. Where was what that she longed for, that she desired for in her heart, in her life? That satisfaction. And that was the place where she had sought it. That's the place where she was looking for it. And so Jesus had her attention. He certainly had her thinking, "I'd sure like some water so I never have to come to this well again." Does that mean she'd been shamed by the other women? Maybe. And rightly so. I mean, she was not perhaps a very reputable woman in society. Um, Jewish law said that men could have 3 wives. I mean, not at the same time, but you could be divorced. And but after that, according to the law, you were just not marriable. You just didn't need to be marrying people after that. And so here's a woman who's been married 5 times. I'm sure not to the same man, but here's a woman who's way outcast. She's way no value to society. And then Jesus even said to her, "The man you're living with now isn't even your husband." Well, why? Because if you can't get satisfied, if your thirst can't get quenched in what you're doing, why even waste your time going through it and doing it right? I mean, I think that's where what the lesson is for us in that. And so what does Jesus say to her? He says, "Go call your husband. Bring him back here." Well, many would say that was the proper thing to do, because here's a man, a Jewish man, nonetheless, talking to a Samaritan woman out in public, broad daylight, high noon. And it's about time he said, "If you'll go get your husband, I'll talk to you about this more." And she then admitted her sin. Actually, Jesus revealed her sin to her. He told her, "You don't have a husband." He didn't call her a liar, because she didn't really lie. But she didn't tell the whole story, did she? And so Jesus said, "You've correctly said." But Jesus, in his wisdom and in his insight, we don't know if the Father revealed that to him. We don't know if the Holy Spirit was, tapping on his shoulder or whispering in his ear saying, "Here's the story about this woman," or if maybe Jesus just knew who she was. We don't know. But we do know he pegged it right. He had the right answer. And the right answer was that she had exceeded by 2 marriages. She was way over the top here. And Jesus wasn't saying this to condemn her. I don't believe that was what he was doing. He was simply revealing to her that her unfulfilled thirst wasn't going to get fulfilled as long as she kept the direction she was going. There was a better way. There was a more direct way. And that's where she could find her satisfaction. She was a sinner. She'd broken covenant with God. She'd sinned against God. Her broken sexuality and her relationships were symptoms of the fact that she was broken inside. In case you didn't know, we live in a broken world, folks. And we're all broken. Every one of us has been broken. And there's only one way to get fixed. And that's through getting the living water that Jesus offers. He is the one who has the way of life. And so Jesus said to her, and he didn't condemn her. I think he was just reminding her, "Oh yeah, you've had 5 husbands, and the one you're with now is really not your husband." He was simply helping her to come to grips with that she wasn't satisfied, and she wasn't going to be satisfied And she'd taken every angle or every avenue that she could, and she wasn't getting there. It wasn't happening for her. So what does Jesus do? He reveals her sin. A gospel that doesn't reveal the sin is no gospel at all. Um, C.S. Lewis said, an ever increasing craving for an ever diminishing pleasure. Um, that's kind of what sin is, isn't it? It's an ever increasing craving for an ever diminishing pleasure, and it never satisfies. So the woman tried to change the subject with Jesus, and then she kind of tried to skirt the issue, and she kind of brought it around to some other things. She talked about worshiping. She talked about where to worship. We're gonna in our lesson, it doesn't include some of these verses, but she kind of got off the subject a little bit there. And we don't know if she did that intentionally, if her mind was just, beginning to think or wonder, or she's coming to grips with stuff. Sometimes that happens to us. We have pretty human minds. Sometimes we get sidetracked. I can chase a lot of rabbits and not catch any of them. That's for sure. But Jesus was trying to help her deal with the tragic nature of sin. And Paul said in Romans, the wages of sin is death. And so Jesus is trying to help her understand that the route you're on, the route you're going, you're number one, never going to be satisfied. And number two, it always leads to destruction. He's trying to help her understand that there is a way that's better, and it's him. He is the way. So then we jump down to verse 25, and again, I said she brings up these verses, or these questions about, Samaritans say you got to worship here, Jews say you got to worship there. What's it all about? And Jesus said, the day's coming when we're not going to worship about location. It's not going to be in the location. It's going to be in the heart. That's what's going to change. So then she says to him in verse 25, I know that the Messiah is coming, who is called the Christ. Christos in the Greek. I'll spit it out in a minute. He's the Christos. Messias would be the Hebrew word for that. It means anointed one. Both Jews and Samaritans were waiting for this Redeemer. Both of them who had come from the same father, Abraham, they'd come from the same lineage. They were waiting for the promise of God. They were waiting for this Messiah, this Redeemer, this anointed one who was going to come. Their views of the Redeemer were different. Those in the north were more focused on maybe a leader like Moses, maybe someone like Moses who was going to lead them, who's going to take them somewhere or get them someplace else, to a land flowing with milk and honey or something like that, who's going to get them in a better place. Moses gave the law. They were also, the Jews, they were looking for a leader like David. David was the king. David was the anointed one by the prophet Samuel, and he led the people to conquer. He got them in a place where they could actually say they had conquered the land, the promised land that God had given them. And so both of them were looking for that kind of person. There was something about David where it always says that he was a man after God's own heart. So the Jews were looking for that kind of a leader. The Israelites, or the Samaritans in the north, were looking for a Moses kind of leader. Here's the good news. Jesus is both. Moses brought the law. He brought that covenant. Jesus brought a new covenant. He said, I didn't come to destroy the law, but to fulfill it. Is Jesus like David? Well, not a warrior physically, but he is a warrior spiritually. He won the battle. He has given us the victory. So in Jesus, both those expectations were fulfilled, weren't they? Well, what does she say? She says, I know the Messiah is coming. And again, is she still trying to change the subject, or is she chasing a rabbit, or what's she doing? I think she's trying to understand it. She's trying to figure out, what does all this mean? And then she's almost putting it together, well, the Messiah is coming. And then she's thinking, what you're promising me almost sounds, deeper than I can comprehend. What you're telling me is more than I can get. What does this really mean? And what does Jesus say to her? Well, she said, when the Messiah comes, he will explain everything to us. And in verse 26, Jesus told her, I, the one who is speaking to you, am he. I'm the Messiah. So out of that confession, he uses that I am when God appeared to Moses in the burning bush, in the desert, in the wilderness, on the mountain. What did God say to Moses? He said, I am. When Moses said, who should I say sent me? I am sent me. Okay. Oh, we're about out of time here. Better get rolling, didn't we? So anyway, Jesus uses those I am statements throughout John's gospel. He picks them out a lot, and do a word study or a search on that sometime, because it's really, really intriguing. And Jesus made those statements. He said, I'm the bread of life. I'm the light of the world. I'm the good shepherd. I'm the resurrection and the life. He said, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. And then he said in I believe it's John 15, he said, I am the true vine. And you got to be grafted in to me. So out of that, he's really making sure that we get and that we understand the truth here. John is. And he tells the story about the woman at the well who came to get water, and Jesus offered her something greater. And we know that her life was changed, even though we don't know any more about her. But we do know that what did she do? She left her bucket, she left her pail. She went into town and she started telling everybody. Now, here's a woman who's not very believable, who's not got much credibility, who's an outcast, and yet she went in. And what happened was gobs of people came out to hear Jesus, and he taught, and many became believers because of her testimony about how Jesus had revealed her sin to her, about how he had changed her life, or had helped her see who she was, and about her desire to change her life because of the living water that he was giving. Well, let you go. Bye-bye.